So the original Dragon Ball series really didn't have a lot of transformations. In fact, it barely had any. The only ones that come to mind right now are Goku becoming a great ape, obviously, which I covered in the first edition of the transformation guide, and Man-Wolf? Is that it? I don't count Piccolo getting younger as a transformation, even though I guess it could be considered one. I just don't consider it one. But when we got to Dragon Ball Z, there was almost an overabundance of transformations, not just within the manga and anime and all those stories that I've already covered, but also with the Dragon Ball Z movies. And almost every major Dragon Ball Z movie villain also has a transformation. So on this special edition of the Transformation Guide, we're going to go through the Dragon Ball Z movies and discuss the exclusive movie transformations. Cooler, Janemba, even Garlic Jr. will be talked about on this video. So when discussing the transformations of the various movie villains, let's start at the beginning and move forward. And the beginning was Dragon Ball Z, the movie, known outside of Japan as Dead Zone in the Western world, and Garlic Jr. Now, Garlic Jr. is the first Dragon Ball Z movie villain. Obviously, he was modeled and inspired by Pilaf, except Pilaf was never this strong, nor was he ever an immortal. And not only is Garlic able to transform, but so are his henchmen. Now, when his henchmen transform, they don't really seem that different. They're just larger, buffer, but their speed also goes up. Ginger, Nikki, and Sancho scream out a very unusual thing before they transform. Ginger screams out Shogayaki, Nikki screams out Nodoame, and Sancho screams out Unaju, which that translates to ginger fried pork, throat lozenges, and rice with eel on top. That's just classic humor from Toei, knowing Toriyama's love of food puns. And it's interesting because his lackeys from the Garlic Jr. saga also seem to get bigger, commonly known as the Spice Boys, which is a fan-made term, but it fits, I guess. For Garlic Jr., though, he starts off as a little munchkin guy who doesn't really seem to be too strong, even though he is able to pound the crap out of Kami, who, during this point of the series, was very powerful. He was very strong, comparably speaking to other characters at the very beginning of DBZ, aka the end of Dragon Ball. So he looked impressive there, but when he transforms, he is so big that he's able to take on Goku and Piccolo for quite some time until they remove their weighted clothing and work together. And they were actually able to get the upper hand on him, but they could not kill him because he had wished for immortality earlier in the movie. But I do believe that had he not wished for immortality, Goku and Piccolo together could have beaten him. However, he does create the Dead Zone, which leads to Gohan rising up, tapping into that secret power he has, and knocking Garlic into his own Dead Zone, putting him away for at least a few arcs until he came back in the TV anime filler. Now, when it comes to Dragon Ball Z movies 2, 3, and 4, those villains really don't transform at all. In fact, Dr. Weedo is inside of the wall with his true mecha body, and you don't see the true mecha body until later in the film, but it's not really a transformation because he always had that body. It was just hidden inside the walls of his chamber. So I don't think I count that as transformation. Turles is a guy who really didn't transform, even though in the video games, he can become a great ape in some of the games, and obviously he has a tail and whatnot. He just gets stronger when he eats the Tree of Might fruit, and that's it. Like, that's pretty much all he does. It's not really a transformation, though. It's just that he gets a big power boost, a huge one at that, and seems to be a lot faster and stronger. And then with Lord Slug, it's pretty much the exact same thing as Demon King Piccolo. In fact, the movie really is just like a really cheap reboot of the Piccolo arc. It really feels that way. It's the same exact story. At least when it comes to Slug, who's an old man, but he wishes to be young. Again, is that really a transformation? I don't know. He can also turn gigantic, which I guess could be a transformation, but again, turning giant without an actual metamorphosis of your appearance to me is not a transformation. If it is to you, well, I've covered it here, but to me, it's really not. But things get very interesting when we get to Cooler. Now, while we do have some actual tangible data on Cooler's transformations, it's still one of those things that has a lot of mystery behind it. So, when we first see Cooler in the movie and throughout most of Dragon Ball Z Movie 5, he's in what resembles Frieza's fourth form, which is essentially what he himself even says, equal to that of Frieza, which is their base form as I covered in the Frieza transformation guide. And Cooler then states, well, I can go one step beyond. Now, to me, that's always been very strange because when Toriyama first wrote the character of Frieza, there is no one step beyond the final form except for when he got to 100% power, which is just him at max power. Cooler should theoretically not have another transformation because his base form, his original birth form, is the one that he uses before he transforms. And that's always been weird to me because if Frieza says that his other forms were created to contain his power, why would Cooler have a further form? It could be possible, and again, this is just headcanon, that Cooler trained so hard that he was able to discover this form. We did find out that Frieza never trained according to Resurrection F, but Frieza instead found the golden form. Cooler found this form, and unfortunately there's just no real explanation as to why Cooler was able to do this and not Frieza or anybody else. Now, in the Daizenshu, the guidebooks, they refer to his final form as Cooler's final stage. Now, I'm a huge fan of this transformation because it looks incredibly cool, no pun intended. He gets huge, he gets these demonic horns, and he has this like mask covering his face when he talks. And being a kid, before I got into Dragon Ball, I loved turtles, so me being a fan of Shredder, that instantly appealed to me, you know what I'm saying? So Cooler was a monster in this final form that he has. And of course, recently in Dragon Ball Heroes, that form now has a golden form. So is it the 6th form? I don't know, but it's best not to overthink it. It's just something that Cooler knows how to do. Now, when it comes to Dragon Ball Z Movie 6, when Cooler returned, here he becomes Meta Cooler, but his form is not the 5th form or the final form. When he's in Meta Cooler form, he looks like his 4th form, his regular form, but we find out that that's not even really Cooler, they're just clones. And the real Cooler is the one who's inhabiting the Big Getty Star. That's the true version of Cooler, who's pretty much this sort of mutated machine type thing. You know, some call him Cable Cooler, who's this big mutant, like Borg Star Trek looking thing. That movie got a lot of influence from Star Trek, by the way, like a lot of influence from Star Trek. And I guess the nanotechnology from the Big Getty Star is what was able to give him that power, but Goku and Vegeta together were able to put an end to the Big Getty Star and to Cooler. The villain of Dragon Ball Z Movie 7 is androids 13, 14, and 15. And they are the secret artificial humans that were created in the basement of the laboratory that battle Goku, Trunks, and Vegeta, the 3 Super Saiyans, as that movie is called in Japan. Well, anyways, these guys are already pretty strong as it is, but what ends up happening is when 14 and 15 are defeated, the mechanical neuroprocessor, or whatever you want to call it, I guess you can call it the processor, is telekinetically transferred into the brain of 13, and he transforms into Super Android 13, who looks, strangely enough, sort of like a Saiyan. I mean, he's got spiky orange hair, you know, so if you ever wanted a Super Saiyan orange, this might be the closest we're going to get to it, unless Toriyama decides to actually give it to Goku, which I don't think he will. But either way, 13 is this giant hulking monster who barely even talks. He just screams. He's a rage beast, very similar to Broly, in fact. Now, Daizenshu 6 refers to this transformation as Gatai Jusango, which stands for Integrated 13. So that's the actual name of that form. It's not Super Android 13, it's Integrated 13, but Super Android 13 works. It's not a terrible name or anything, but he becomes very, very strong. And of course, this was done to sort of mimic Cell. Cell had to absorb 17 and 18 to become perfect. 13 had to absorb the microprocessor of 13 and 14 to become perfect. So there you go. Now, when it comes to Broly, I already covered Broly in the Legendary Super Saiyan Transformation Guide. The only thing that I did not cover is Bio Broly, but there's not much to say about Bio Broly because he's just a clone. In fact, the official name for this character is Bio Broly, according to Daizenshu 6, which is kind of using legendary form, but it's a clone, and there's not much more to it than that. Moving on to Dragon Ball Z Movie 9, we have Bojack, and he's not the only one who can transform in that movie. One of his henchmen, Gokua, is also able to transform. Now, Gokua in the English dub is referred to as Kogu, and I think they did that because they didn't want to call him Gokua because it sounds too much like Goku. Now, he's the guy who fights Trunks, and he sort of powers up into a transformed state which I think was the writer sort of giving us a preview of what Bojack would do later in the movie, like a teaser, so to speak, some foreshadowing there, similar to when Zarbon transformed on Namek and warned Vegeta that Frieza can do it too. That was our first hint that Frieza could transform. Same thing here. It's interesting though because there's some weird animation mistakes or whatever where the hair keeps changing, but either way, that's his form. And then of course at the end of the film, we have Bojack powering up, and his powered up form is just like Garlic Jr. really. He's just bigger and buffer and has no shirt on. And he transforms pretty quickly, but he is no match for the son of Goku, Gohan, who mutilates this guy. I mean, he had no chance. And for those of you wondering, do Bojack's other minions transform? Unfortunately, we do not know. None of the guidebooks ever state that they can, and there's no interview saying they can, so probably not. It's probably just those two. So like I've said before, the movie villains tend to somewhat mimic the anime or the manga or whatever's going on, and that brings us to Janemba, who is very similar to Majin Buu in that his first form, he's this kind of, big, round, childlike, baby kind of demonic being like Fat Buu, and then when he gets serious, he becomes what is commonly referred to as Super Janemba, and he looks more serious, more evil, and kind of reminds me of Super Buu. It's the same concept here, but Janemba's design is pretty damn awesome. Goku pummels the first form of Janemba in Super Saiyan 3, and then he reveals himself to be this scary looking red and purple demonic being that can do all kinds of crazy stuff, including manipulation of matter and things of that nature, which is something we haven't seen a villain do, before that. Janemba was the first one to really do it to that level. If you want to learn more about how terrifying Janemba is, I did a Strongest in Dragon Ball on Janemba, where we talk about his powers a bit more, but as far as his forms go, there isn't much else to say here. And we move on to the final Dragon Ball Z movie villain, Hirudegarn. Now, Hirudegarn is really just a giant bug, except a mutant bug from another galaxy. But either way, he basically starts out as being a form that is chopped in half, and we find out why and what happened, the backstory in the movie. And when he finally gets the full version of himself, he becomes very, very strong. Now, Hirudegarn was the largest natural villain that Goku and the gang ever faced. I'm not talking about guys who can grow gigantic or even Aniraza. He was naturally a big, giant Godzilla kaiju monster they fought, which I guess was done because kaiju's so big in Japan that the people who made this movie just thought, hey, wouldn't it be cool if Goku and the gang fought a kaiju? So that would make sense to me if that was the story behind Hirudegarn's creation, but he pretty much goes in and transforms into this giant sort of moth butterfly, except, a butterfly from hell. Gotenks goes in there and forces him to go into this cocoon or this embryo or whatever you want to call it, larva form, and then he comes out with wings and he's big and he's just really hard to kill. Of course, he becomes a lot stronger, so strong that he's able to knock Super Saiyan 3 Gotenks out of fusion. So anybody who sits there and says that Broly's the strongest movie villain, maybe the new Broly, but old Broly probably had nothing on Hirudegarn. Remember, this guy one-shotted SS3 Gotenks. Don't forget that. He's really powerful, but if Goku can't do it, nobody can, and Goku winds up beating Hirudegarn with a move that he just invented out of thin air in one of the weirdest Deus Ex Machinas in Dragon Ball, but one that people love because they love the move, the Dragon Fist. That will do it for the Dragon Ball Z movie villains breakdown for their transformations. I hope that you enjoyed the video, and coming up next, it's GT. We'll see you in the next one.